This week on Jerusalem Dateline, a look ahead at the coming year. Does the terror attack in Paris foretell an increase in terrorism in 2015? What about the Middle East? Does war loom ahead? Will the U.S. Israel relationship be tested this year? And what about Christians throughout the Middle East suffering through some of the worst persecution in centuries? Our CBN News team takes a look and looks ahead. This week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. This week we take a look at what we can expect in the year 2015. I'm joined here in our Jerusalem Bureau by CBN News' Julie Stahl and in our CBN headquarters by John Waggy and Dale Hurd. We're just a few days into 2015 and already Muslim extremists have carried out a vicious terror attack in France. They attacked a newspaper known for making fun of radical Islam and even publishing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. Dale, you've been to Paris many times and chronicled the rise of radical Islam there. What can you tell us about who this group might be and why they targeted this newspaper?
Well, they told the person that let them into the building, an employee, they were Al-Qaeda. And Charlie Hebdo is one of these far-left magazines featuring cartoons, some of which are frankly profane. And so they've enraged Muslims with the way they've made fun of the Prophet Muhammad.
And what can you tell us about the growth and strength of radical Islam in Europe, particularly in Paris? I know you've done some amazing stories there, Dale, about some actually no-go zones, parts of Paris where police don't go, where basically Muslims control those parts of Paris. Right,
and we have to make the point that you're going to see the idea that these guys were with ISIS and they came back, and that may be true, and they've said they were Al-Qaeda. But you know, you wouldn't need for Al-Qaeda or ISIS to exist for this to happen because of the sort of toxic environment in France, which both minimizes the threat of radical Islam and keeps these people in a ghetto by themselves called no-go zones. Police don't go there. They're in control of some of these areas, and that's where they planned this attack.
Do you think part of this is the fruit of political correctness? And why do you think the French government hasn't been stronger in confronting radical Islam?
Because the label Islamophobe in France can end your career if you're a politician or a journalist. Remember that during the Christmas season, 2 vans in France plowed into people, at least one driven by a Muslim, and we had a knife attack on French police officers by a Muslim. And the French government never said that these were related to Islam. They are saying that this is related to Islam, but this whole minimalization of the problem made this outcome a mathematical certainty. We knew this was going to happen someday.
Yeah, and Dale, in a larger sense, do you think this is an attack on free speech, not only in France, but the rest of the Western world?
To me, it's a statement that Muslims believe they're going to win. There are only 6 million Muslims in France. I mean, that's a lot. They had the boldness to do this. And I'll say something else. We've done stories in which the French have warned that France would become Lebanon someday because of the way they've coddled terrorists. And what happened in Paris is something that would have happened in Beirut. A news office was raided. Journalists were killed, and you have a small army operating inside France.
Yeah, Julie, talking about Islam, you know, 2014 ended and 2015 began with an attempt by the Palestinian Authority to have themselves declared a state by the United Nations Security Council. That vote failed, and now they're trying to get into the International Criminal Court. And we have a soundbite by Yair Lapid, the former finance minister here in Israel, about that thing.
Israel will not allow the Palestinians to drag our soldiers to the ICC. The Israeli army, the IDF, is the most moral army in the world. We have examined ourselves more thoroughly than any other army has ever did in the history of wars. And this is just pure and low propaganda, and we will not tolerate with this.
Julie, how do you think the Netanyahu government is responding to what the Palestinian Authority is doing right now?
Well, we heard what Yair Lapid said. He's basically saying the same thing that Benjamin Netanyahu is saying, that Israel, these soldiers that would be brought before the criminal court, that they have fought for Israel. They have laid their lives down for Israel, and so Israel will fight for them. Israel is not part of the International Criminal Court, but if those soldiers, for instance, traveled to Europe, traveled to South Africa, they could be arrested in those countries and tried. But Israel's not going to let that happen if it's possible. Israel is probably also going to play hardball and throw it back in the Palestinians' court. If they actually do bring charges against Israel, Israel will definitely bring charges against them for attacking civilians.
One other big thing that's been happening last year and probably this year as well is the confrontation over the Temple Mount. Do you expect that to be a big issue in the coming year?
I do believe it will be. I think that's going to be an issue until the Lord returns. The Temple Mount is, as we know, it's a holy place to the Muslims, but it's also the place where the Jewish temple sat. It's definitely, the more and more Jewish people want to go up there and pray. They're not afraid of a ruckus. And so I think it's definitely going to continue this year.
Yeah. John, one major issue that's been happening, and this week a new Congress was sworn in, and now the Republicans control not only the House, but they control the Senate as well. What impact do you think that's going to have on diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Israel?
Well, I think that there's a very good chance that there's going to be much tighter scrutiny of those relations and probably a spotlight being shown on the kinds of things that the Obama administration has tried to accomplish behind closed doors. Rand Paul just this week, the new Congress was barely in its seats, and Rand Paul has proposed a cutoff of funding to the Palestinian Authority for their willingness to take Israel to the International Criminal Court. Now, this is the kind of thing that you can see in hearings in both the House and Senate, and I think that President Obama, John Kerry, and the major foreign policy actors in the Obama administration are going to have to answer for more, if for no other reason than the 2016 presidential elections already begun, and there are a lot of not only Republican candidates, but Democrats who want to distance themselves from some of the Obama policies that are going to say, wait a minute, what are we doing here? What is the United States doing? Are they making things better in the Middle East or worse? And I think that you're going to see a lot of questioning of what the Obama administration's been doing.
Yeah, John, do you also think that this new Congress is going to have an impact on the nuclear negotiations with Iran?
Well, I think it will. I think that they've indicated in the past year, even before Republicans took the Senate, that both Republicans and Democrats were very concerned about a bad deal with Iran. And I think that they will hold hearings to profile what the administration's been doing and try to hold their feet to the fire. Now, President Obama's going for a legacy, so at the same time, he's calling for Iran to take its rightful place in the community of nations. So I'm not sure he's going to pay that much attention to Congress. He certainly hasn't so far. And now that Republicans control it, I don't know that he'll do any more than that. But we do have the 2016 election as a backdrop for all of this foreign policy debate.
Yeah, we'll see how that happens this coming year. One other thing, John, that's we're anticipating over here in Israel is a new elections coming up in March. Even though we're a few months away from that, how would you sort of define the political landscape over here in Israel?
Well, I think that the Israeli elections are going to pretty much commandeer the attention in the Middle East unless we see some sort of war or concerted attack. I think that Benjamin Netanyahu dissolved the Knesset so he could try to get a more agreeable coalition for what he thinks, I believe, is a preparation for possible war, and he wants to have some stability and cut down on the sniping. Now, the left is arguing Netanyahu is not being tough on groups like Hamas, and at the same time they're saying he poisoned the atmosphere with the United States and Europe, and so they will be the ones that can get along. Well, you can't stand up to Hamas and get along with the West and with Washington. And so the left is going to have some trouble with that. We'll see how it plays out in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, that'll be one of the major things that we'll be looking forward to this year. Well, Dale, John, and Julie, thank you very much. And coming up, we'll talk more about the rise of Islamic terrorism throughout the Middle East and around the world. Welcome back. The terror attack in Paris raises concerns about increasing anti-Semitism throughout Europe and the Middle East. Gary Lane, Julie Stahl, and Dale Hurd are here for more on this topic. Dale, anti-Semitism is on the rise in Europe, and you've covered that topic extensively throughout the years. How bad is the situation for Jews in Europe right now?
They tell me it's as bad as it's been since the 1930s. Virtually every synagogue that I've visited in Europe has security around it, police, and often these synagogues have their own security details, synagogue members that have formed their own private security force to police the neighborhood. Jews in Europe tell me that they expect more Jews to die. They expect more Jews to be murdered. It's just a matter of where and when it will happen.
Gary, the Holocaust, the mass extermination of Jews in Europe, it's just barely 70 years ago. How can European governments be so complacent about anti-Semitism?
Well, they're complacent about a lot of things, Chris. Actually, complacent about the rise of radical Islam. They don't see radical Islam as a threat. And I think as you're seeing more anti-Semitism, more attacks in Europe, you're going to see more people in Europe, more Europeans standing up against this and putting pressure on their governments to respond.
Yeah, and Gary, obviously it's not just Europe, but it's also what's happening with anti-Semitism in the Middle East.
Well, anti-Semitism has been there for centuries in the Middle East, but it isn't just anti-Semitism, it's anti-Christianity. There are many Muslims that are very much against the Christians. As we know, ISIS, talking to Christians there in Iraq, and also some that have fled violence in Syria. They are saying, and they have told me, that they really face extinction now. I had Christians telling me they expect maybe no more than about 150,000 Christians will remain in that country because of the rise of ISIS.
Right. And I know we'll talk more about that in the next segment, Gary. You know, Julie, one thing that's happened here in Israel is the record number of Jews immigrating from Europe here to Israel. What's happening?
Well, that's very interesting what Dale said, that the Jews are saying it's the worst anti-Semitism since the 1930s. The difference between now and then is they have someplace to come. They can come to Israel. So, and many of them are. Last year, there was the highest amount of French Jews ever. It was the highest amount of French Jews were the highest amount of Jews to enter Israel, and there were more than 7,000. But Natan Sharansky said 50,000 Jews, French Jews, asked for information on immigrating last year. That's amazing. And just this week, the head of one of the anti-Semitic watchdog organizations announced that he is going to immigrate to Israel, and he said it's a message, and the message is it's better to leave than to have to run away. So I think that's the trend we're going to see, especially of the French Jews. And we just did a story back in December about not only French Jews, but Jews from Ukraine. So this seems to be an increasing trend throughout Europe and different places. Dale, back to you. I asked Gary this question. Why do you think some of these European governments don't recognize anti-Semitism, don't defend against it, and sort of don't address this issue of radical Islam?
Well, they play a double game. I mean, when Jews are killed, the head of state will go out and lay a wreath. But the big culprit in Europe is the media and the vilification of Israel. And anti-Israel has sort of morphed into anti-Semitism. And so the big blame lies with the media.
And what do you see for the next coming year? Do you see the rise of more anti-Semitism and the rise of radical Islam there in Europe?
I think it's only going to get worse, although the event that started today, you could call it in a sense France's 9/11, not in numbers of dead, but this is a wake-up call for France. And France is a leader in Europe, and perhaps we will see a change now in the way radical Muslims are treated. And Julie, finally back to you. The year ahead, do you see more Jews emigrating from Europe and around the world?
I do believe they will. They'll be coming. I think that's what Israel believes too, that they're preparing for, for immigrants. They always have immigrants here. They have a very good system of absorbing immigrants, teaching them the language, teaching them Hebrew. So they'll be prepared.
Yeah, and I know one thing we addressed in our story, this is a prophetic fulfillment.
It is definitely a prophetic fulfillment. Yeah. And, the Lord is going to fulfill His word. And He says He's going to bring the Jewish people back from all over the world to Israel. Yeah, and it's happening. It is happening. Well, Julie, Gary, Dale, thank you. Well, up next, the rise of ISIS and the spread of Christian persecution, some say was the worst in centuries. One of the biggest stories this year has been the rise of Christian persecution. Some say ethnic cleansing of Christians from the Middle East. Here's CBN News correspondent George Thomas.
From the Middle East to sub-Saharan Africa, Christians are enduring attacks for their faith like never before.
The persecution of Christians is real. It is horrifically violent often, and it is spreading at an unprecedented rate in modern times.
Dr. David Curry is president of Open Doors, a group that monitors religious freedom worldwide. He says Christians face the most persecution in 2014 than in any other year in recent history.
We have seen the sharpest jump in violent attacks against Christians in the modern era.
Open Doors reports that 4,344 Christians were killed for their faith in 2014, double the number in 2013.
These aren't Christians who are collateral damage in a larger war. These are people who are targeted because they choose to worship Jesus, because they want to read a Bible, and that's shocking.
On Wednesday, the group released its annual World Watch list, ranking the top 50 countries where Christians face the most persecution. North Korea topped the list once again for the 13th year in a row, with some 70,000 Christians reportedly languishing in prison camps.
The government has a paranoia about any ideology which they see as a threat to their cult worship of their leaders. And so they rank enemies of the state. Christians are the #1 enemy of the state in North Korea.
Rounding the top 10 worst violators are Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, Iran, Pakistan, Eritrea, and Nigeria. But in a majority of the countries, Curry says elements of one religion above all poses the greatest threat to Christians.
Islamic extremism is a driving force, is really the driving force in 40 of the top 50 countries on the World Watch list.
The majority of the deaths last year happened in Nigeria, where kidnappings and murders by the Islamic group Boko Haram killed 2,484 Christians.
Nigeria needs prayers. Nigeria needs prayers.
Damaris Atson has experienced Boko Haram's wrath firsthand. In 2010, her husband was stabbed to death by the Islamic fighters. She said it has taken the grace of God to forgive her husband's killers.
If I do not forgive, the Lord will not forgive me. So I have to forgive, because Jesus teaches us to forgive one another.
Meanwhile, the terrorist group known as Islamic State, or ISIS, continues to drive hundreds of thousands of Christians from Syria and Iraq. Curry worries their success at targeting minority faiths is giving impetus to other radical groups to pursue similar tactics around the world.
So you have the Islamic State, their tactics, their methodology now being adopted by Boko Haram, by Al-Shabaab, and others. And so I think this means that while this year was the worst ever, things look very troubling for years to come.
Open Doors says the World Watch list is a wake-up call to the tragic suffering of Christians around the world.
We need to make the persecuted church an issue of prayer and a support because there's a genocide happening.
George Thomas, CBN News.
Well, joining us to talk more about this is CBN News correspondent Gary Lane. Gary, the biggest culprit of this persecution this past year was ISIS. You just visited many of those Christians who lost their homes because of ISIS. What did you see and hear?
Well, Chris, you were there as well in June and again in August, as I was. And, you know, this is probably the worst crisis I have seen in 30 years of reporting in the Middle East. Looking at persecution, looking at refugees. I've never seen these mass numbers of persecuted, not just Christians, but also ethnics like Yazidis and Muslims. It is horrible, and it has gotten better for them as far as their housing, their food and blanket needs, things like that. But there are still other needs, like education for the children. But what the people were telling me, and I'm sure they told you this, Chris, is that the Muslims, when they came in, ISIS, when they came into Mosul and the surrounding Christian villages, and also the Yazidis, when they came into the Yazidi areas, they were not alone. There were Arab Muslim neighbors that these people lived with for years, that they had good relations with, that suddenly turned on them and joined ISIS and forced them out. Yeah. They had the choice to either stay and live under Sharia law and pay a jizya tax, or leave or die, or convert to Islam. What kind of choice is that? But they're in dire straits still.
Yeah, those are the same exact stories that I heard, Gary, that their neighbors turned on them just within a few hours or a few days. What do you think we can expect for the coming year?
Well, I think things have gotten better for them in Iraq as the Peshmerga, that is the Kurdish military, has joined with the U.S. in countering ISIS. They pushed ISIS out of Sinjar not too long ago. Many of these Christian villages are free of ISIS now, but the Christians cannot go back because many of their homes have been booby-trapped and ISIS is still within artillery range. So they're going to have to remain in Erbil and other cities in tents and in prefabricated one-room houses and that type of thing. I don't think ISIS will be as much of a threat in Iraq in the coming year as they will be in Syria. Syria is going to continue. We met with people who fled from Kobani. They are in dire straits and in desperate need of help. ISIS will continue to be on the move there. As far as Iraq, it's going to depend on what happens with the government there in Baghdad and if they will go up against ISIS in Mosul. The Peshmerga say they're ready to join Baghdad in liberating Mosul, but they're not going to do it alone.
Right. Well, Gary, how can we help and pray for these Christians and these other Yazidis that have been just tormented and had their lives just mainly destroyed by ISIS?
Chris, I think we should pray that God visits them and brings them Christian brothers and sisters that will stand along with them and help them. The kids desperately need education, so they need schools to be established in these areas where they are temporary residents. Also that they will be able to return to their homes. But we need to, there are many people that have fled and they're going to the West. We need to pray that Christians remain in Iraq to be salt and light. One pastor that you and I both know said, if all the Christians leave, who will represent Jesus here? Who will be salt and light in Iraq? So pray not only for their provision, but pray that they will stay.
Yeah, great points, Gary. And thanks for all your reporting throughout the years,
Sure.
not only what's happening with Christians now in Syria and Iraq, but actually throughout the world.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, up next, what can we do to pray for the coming year? Here in Jerusalem, snow fell this week and Israel experienced a major winter storm. For some, the snow is a reminder of the scripture from the book of Job. It says in Job 38:22 and 23, "Have you entered the treasury of snow, or have you seen the treasury of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war?" It does seem like a time for battle and war this year, but it's also a time for prayer. He also holds the future. And the snow is a great reminder to pray for this coming year. Please join us in prayer for His will to be done this coming year here in the Middle East and around the world. Thanks for joining us in this edition of Jerusalem Dateline, and thanks to our CBN News team for their analysis for the coming year. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline, and Happy New Year.